At the same time, we have consistently applied all of our laws and procedures to protect the border. These two are not mutually exclusive, as some would suggest. Let me be clear. Asylum claimants are subject to a separate system and have absolutely no impact on applicants in other immigration categories, including refugees resettled from abroad. In addition to that, every asylum claimant who enters Canada undergoes medical and security screening at the border, including through biometrics and checked against various databases. No individual is allowed to leave the port of entry until they have passed background checks. If they present a risk to Canadian society, they are immediately detained, do not get to make a refugee claim, and are then removed from Canada. We have invested $173.2 million, including $74 million for the IRB as part of our Budget 2018 investments. This will be used to staff 50 additional decision makers in the Refugee Protection Division and 14 in the Refugee Appeal Division, which will allow them to finalize an additional 17,000 claims for refugee protection and more than 3,000 refugee appeals. I'm also pleased to inform the committee that members of the Immigration Refugee Board are adopting a new approach which will allow them to dedicate a proportional number of resources to asylum claims for those who cross our borders irregularly. Mr. Chair, with the additional investments and the change in scheduling and the ongoing collaboration with various partners and within different government departments and agencies, we've made significant progress in recent months in preparing for any potential influxes. We've closely engaged with the United States on a number of issues, including discussing modernization of the Safe Third Country Agreement. We've stationed senior officials in Nigeria to work with the U.S. Officials and ensure collaboration and sharing of information to prevent the abuse of visas, U.S. visas for the purposes of claiming asylum in Canada. I recently returned from Lagos and Abuja, Nigeria, where I held productive discussions with representatives from the Nigerian government, Nigerian civil society and media to secure their collaboration on travel documents, on messaging, as well as on deterrence. We do all this with 6 guiding principles in mind. There's no free ticket into Canada. People who cross our borders irregularly will be arrested and subject to thorough security screening. Canada respects its international obligations. Those who do not need Canada's protection will be removed. And we've increased funding to our security partners. We will continue to work closely with the provinces, especially Quebec and Ontario, to ensure we have an orderly process for asylum claimants. And we'll continue to work with the U.S. government, both in raising concerns about Safe Third Agreement and on the number of claimants with valid U.S. visas. Finally, Monsieur le Président, l'augmentation du nombre.
Lastly, the increase in asylum seekers presents very obvious challenges. However, Canadians can rest assured that we are managing that challenge very well. With efficiency, with innovative practices, and with fairness. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, in light of the time, and I realize the committee had to start a bit late, and we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock. I won't deliver any formal remarks to save the time, but I would like to introduce the officials who are with me for the information of the committee. On my far right is Brenda Lucky, the new Commissioner of the RCMP. To my immediate right is Jacques Luce, Vice President Operations at CBSA. And at the far end of the table is Patrick Tanguay, who is Assistant Deputy Minister for Public Safety Canada. These are extraordinary public servants who work very hard to keep Canadians safe and to make sure rights and freedoms are safeguarded at the same time. When extraordinary circumstances happen from time to time, such as the situation at some locations along the border, they are called upon to do the very difficult work right on the ground in dealing with people and circumstances to make sure that the situation is properly attended to. They've had to make important adjustments in their arrangements over the course of the last year to make sure that the right resources are in the right place at the right time, and they have done an extraordinary job in the interests of all Canadians.
Thank you very much, Minister. We're going to begin rounds of 7-minute questions. Just a reminder that I will give Ms. Kwana a little bit of generous time because she lost out in the last meeting. So we're going to begin with Mr. Ananda-Sangari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And at the outset, to both ministers, I'd like to thank you for your continued efforts in this and finding the appropriate balance and ensuring that Canada meets its international obligations under the Refugee Convention and the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the Convention Against Torture and other international instruments. I think the manner in which both of your departments have handled this is extraordinary, and I'm quite proud to see this in action. And also, Commissioner Lucky, it's a pleasure to have you here, and the historical shoes that you've taken on is not lost on us, and thank you for that. I want to start, Minister Hussain, with respect to your visit to Nigeria, and if you can outline what specific engagements you had there and what messaging you had to the Nigerian community.
Thank you very much. My visit to Nigeria was very, very productive. I visited the capital city of Abuja as well as the commercial capital city of Lagos. There I met, in Abuja, I met the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Interior, as well in the same day I met the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Nigeria. And both officials, I was able to indicate to them what we were facing. I made it very clear that overall the number of Nigerians coming regularly to Canada is actually high. There's a lot of visitors and tourists as well as international students and people who come through the express entry system as well as the provincial nominee program. So in fact the number that is coming irregularly is smaller than the regular numbers. However, it is an issue, and I emphasized to them the need for that government to cooperate closely with Canada on the issue of reiterating the message that we are always making, that we welcome newcomers, but we want people to come through regular migration. The second request I had of the Nigerian government was that they should work closely with us to expedite the issuing of travel documents for Nigerian nationals who have exhausted the procedures and are set to be removed from Canada. And on both of those requests, the Nigerian government officials that I met, including the foreign minister, were clearly supportive and indicated that very clearly that they'll work with us on both those issues. Very quickly, I also met representatives of various media outlets in Nigeria to, again, make the point that we value the contributions that Nigerian Canadians have made to our country, but that irregular migration is an issue. And I also met civil society organizations who were very kind to let me know some of the challenges, some of the misinformation that was being fed to some of these officials.
Thank you, Minister. With respect to IRB, the Immigration Refugee Board, can you indicate to us the improvements in productivity over the last 3 years?
So even prior to the investments as part of Budget 2018, the Immigration Refugee Board had embarked on certain measures to ensure that they had improved their ability to finalize cases, and there was an increase in their productivity levels with respect to their finalization of cases. In addition to that, Budget 2018 recognizes the importance of investing in the IRB, additional resources to enable them to finalize cases faster, and Budget 2018 therefore commits pledges an amount of $74 million for the Immigration Refugee Board to be able to do that. In addition to that, the IRB has stated that they will institute a new scheduling system that would allow them to proportionally dedicate resources based on the proportional number of asylum claimants who are making asylum claims to the IRB who have crossed the border irregularly. So if, for example, in the eastern region, 60% of their caseload is now people claiming asylum who had crossed the border irregularly. So based on that, they will then dedicate more than half of their resources to process those folks very quickly.
Mr. Goodale, I know we have spoken over the years, and just I know you confirmed it before, but can you confirm that since the last time you were here, the directive with respect to the detention of children is still in effect, and with respect to those who are coming across, and that we're not detaining children in the sense of overnight detention and longer detentions?
The directive is still in full force and effect. And in fact, if that were to change, there would be public notice to that effect. But yes, the changes that we've made progressively over the last couple of years to improve the system around detention, to ensure that it's used only in the appropriate and relevant circumstances, that the conditions of detention are improved, and that there is a supervisory function performed by the Red Cross, for example. All of those changes are fully in effect, and I would reconfirm that we are working on the final element of the plan, which is the creation of a review mechanism for CBSA officials and procedures. CBSA is the one agency in my department that does not have that review function. All of the others do, but we're in the process of moving toward the review function for CBSA as well.
Minister, if I may ask you a very brief question, I know this is going to take longer.
I'm going to be
answer.
draconian. 10 seconds.
Can you advise us on the implications of declaring the entire 9,000 kilometers of border between Canada and the U.S. To be a non-official
I'm afraid I'm going to need to cut you off. I'm sure that question will get asked again, I suspect, but I'm going to go to Ms. Rempel. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On May 23rd in the Stansted Journal, the Minister for International Development and La Francophonie was quoted as saying that, quote, "We had a lot of calls from local businesses last year telling us that they would gladly go pick them up there and hire them, and that since Canada is short on manpower, the influx of people entering illegally through Roxham Road is welcomed by a lot of people." Do the ministers share the opinion of their colleague?
Mr. Chair, the fact of the matter is the issue of the issuing of work permits to asylum seekers was something that was brought to us through the Intergovernmental Task Force on Irregular Migration it was brought forward by the province of Quebec. They felt that it was important for the federal government to help the province of Quebec and other provinces to expedite the issuing of work permits so that asylum seekers can support themselves as opposed to relying on provincial social services.
Mr. Chair.
And we've done that.
Mr. Chair, the sentiment that the Minister of International Development expressed is that it's a good thing that people are illegally entering the country and that this was a way to meet Canada's labour needs. Is that now Canada's policy?
Mr. Chair, the provinces have indicated their preference for asylum seekers to support themselves while they await their hearings, to work, and so for us to assist them in the expediting of the issuing of work permits, which we've done from 3 months to 3 weeks.
Not even close to it.
And instead of them relying on provincial social services.
So Mr. Chair, I would argue that planned orderly migration, where we anticipate economic migration and match it to labor force needs would be a better management of Canada's immigration system, especially since Quebec and Ontario have both expressed that some of the people who are illegally crossing the borders need to be diverted to other places in the country. So I'll ask the question, the Minister very bluntly, does he actually want to stop people from illegally entering the country at the Roxham Road border?
Mr. Chair, that's the question is important because it gives me an opportunity to talk about the things that we are doing. We have consistently said that there is no free ticket.
Mr. Chair, just in the interest of time, a yes or no answer. Does the minister want to stop the vast influx of people illegally crossing the border at Roxham Road from the United States?
Yes.
Does the minister then share the opinion that his minister colleague expressed, that it is acceptable for businesses to go and pick up people at the Roxham Road crossing? And does he feel that this sentiment perhaps incents people to illegally cross the border?
Mr. Chair, we have a clear set of immigration rules and procedures, including rules and procedures dealing with asylum seekers. That's specifically dealt with in Section 133 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And we have an obligation to ensure that the law is enforced.
Thank
and
you,
that's what
Mr.
we
Chair.
try to do in every case.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the Minister of Public Safety, how many people who have illegally crossed the border from the United States into Canada and subsequently claimed asylum since January 2017 have been removed from Canada?
In response to specific statistical questions, Mr. Chair, I wouldn't have those numbers with me today, but I would be more than happy to examine the question in the record of the meeting and provide the answer numerically to the committee.
Mr. Chair, both ministers and the Prime Minister have put this particular aspect, the removal aspect, in the front of their platforms on this. The fact that the minister does not have this number at committee, I would suggest he has it. I would suggest he's hiding it, and I would ask him if he would be able to table this number with committee by the end of this week.
I will endeavour to answer the question as rapidly as possible with full statistical information, Mr. Chair, and I would point out that with the additional resources that have been provided in the last budget,
I have a point of order.
In the last budget,
I hate to interrupt.
We will be able to accelerate the process.
Mr. Chair, I find this quite difficult because I think Ms. Rempel is suggesting that the minister is not being forthright, and in fact she's suggesting that he's being deceiving, and I believe that's unparliamentary and is uncalled for in this committee meeting.
She has the right to do that.
I would say we continue to me. I'm not going to prejudge that, but yes.
I would like, on the same point of order, the opportunity to respond. Mr. Chair, the ministers have put forward the removal aspect as one of the key platform elements in terms of their response to this issue. That the Minister of Public Safety does not know in front of a parliamentary committee how many people have been removed from Canada in this for a parliamentary hearing.
I'm going to interrupt you to say that I believe we're now to debate, and I welcome you to continue your questioning.
No, Mr. Chairman, she's entitled to respond to his comments.
No, once we've moved into a debate,
It's not a debate. She's simply responding.
And I have responded that I'm not considering
You're cutting
this
her
point
off.
of order.
You're out of order, Mr. Chairman.
I'm happy to be challenged on that.
I'm challenging you.
All right.
Wait, point of order, Mr. Chair. Just point of clarification. So you are ruling my colleague's aspersion out of order?
Yes, that's out of order, and I would invite you to continue your questioning.
Thank you.
But if you'd like to pursue the challenge, that is also okay.
No, you've ruled him out of order. That's fine.
Thank you.
Could I make one point, Mr. Chair?
No, Mr. Chair, I would like to continue my questions.
Obviously, she's only interested in disinformation.
Mr. Chair, point of order. If the minister would like to table the amount of people who have been removed from this country who have claimed asylum after illegally entering Canada from the United States since the start of 2017, I would be happy to have that information. However, for the minister to sit here and try and waste my time that I have for questions by saying it's disinformation because he doesn't have this information, I find mildly irritating and somewhat insulting. So I would invite him, if he would like to make a remark, that it would be that specific number, otherwise to let me pursue my line of questioning, as is my right.
I would just remind the committee that it is not our job on the committee to evaluate the quality of an answer. We are to ask our questions. I believe the minister has made an undertaking to the committee to provide those numbers, and I believe that he has made that commitment. I heard it, and I would invite the member to continue.
Mr. Chair, as I understand it, the question covered two fiscal years. I want to ensure I have complete data over 2 fiscal years.
All right, Ms. Rampel.
Yes, the minister has the ability to read the minutes of the meeting, as do all of us. Mr. Chair.
Which is what I said I would do, Mr. Chair. I would like to continue with my
line of questions. The minister's department had said that they were going to provide this committee with the exact lines of service that 800 staff members have been redirected to the border from to the Roxham Road issue from other lines. They have not provided that information. When does the minister anticipate providing that information to committee?
Mr. Chair, those are undertakings made previously by officials in their appearances before the committee, and I understand the requested information is available and will be tabled shortly with the committee.
When?
Either today or tomorrow, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Will the minister also provide a similar breakdown of the amount of RCMP and number of RCMP officers that have been redirected to the Roxham Road border crossing in terms of details on which lines of activity they work in? Essentially, I'm trying to get an understanding of where resources have been redirected from to deal with the Roxham Road issue.
So to be clear, Mr. Chair, the question is with respect to the same information that was earlier requested of CBSA. The member is now making a request for parallel information for the RCMP.
That's correct.
Commissioner Lucky is here. She's heard the request, and I'm sure she'll respond to it to the very best of her ability as soon as that data can be
Thank you very
tabulated.
much. I need to move to Ms. Kwan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the ministers. My first question is to the Minister of Immigration. He mentioned that his officials are engaging in a discussion with the United States about quote-unquote modernizing the Safe Third Country Agreement. I'm wondering whether or not in those discussions, if the government has raised the issue of the problem being the United States themselves, and that being that every time the president utters some or tweets some anti-immigrant, anti-refugee rhetoric, it creates a situation and there's a reaction related to that. I wonder whether or not that has been brought up at the table with our U.S. counterpart.
So the discussions with respect to the Safe Third Country Agreement are in the early days. There's no formal negotiations.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I'm just going to interrupt here. My question is whether or not the minister has raised the issue on the asylum seekers crossing over to Canada as a result of the behavior of the President of the United States.
So there are no formal negotiations with respect to the Safe Third Country Agreement. The discussions essentially on opportunities to modernize the agreement.
Has there been informal discussions brought up about the issue resting with the behavior of the President of the United States from this government?
As I said just earlier, the discussions have basically looked at the possibility of modernizing the agreement as any 14-year-old agreement would be would be ripe for modernization.
That wasn't my question to the minister. The minister fails to understand, and I'm trying to see whether or not the government has raised the issue to the core of the issue. The core of the issue is not so much about the asylum seekers themselves crossing over, but what causes them to do that. What causes them to do that, frankly, in my view, rests with the U.S. administration, and most particularly with the president himself. Has that been brought to the table? And perhaps maybe Minister Goodale can answer that question. Has his ministry or his ministry officials brought that forward?
So there was no misunderstanding of the question. I understood your question. We just have a different perspective on asylum seekers and how they should claim asylum where.
Sorry.
We have a UN-supported
Mr. Chair,
position.
my question was to Mr. Goodale.
Asylum seekers should be
Mr. Chair, my question was to
claim
Mr.
asylum
Goodale.
in the first safe country that they land in.
Mr. Chair, my question was to Mr. Goodale.
I'd make two observations in response to that, Ms. Kwan. The first is that the beginning of this issue actually took place before there was a change in administration in the United States. So there's not a specific correlation that's identifiable because the numbers began before the government changed in the United States. Secondly, we have raised with American officials a concern that if they change policy in the United States with respect to the status of persons who have been given temporary protected status in the United States, that could have an impact on border management with Canada. And we have encouraged the Americans in every case to give as much advance notice as possible of their intention to make a status change so that we can be prepared to deal with the consequences of that. And since we made that request to the Americans quite some time ago, they have adopted a practice, in fact, of giving 18 to 20 months notice before a status change would come into effect. So we have observed that status changes in the United States could have an impact on the border. We have requested that they give advance notice if they have a status change in mind, and they have complied with that request and are now consistently, in every case, I believe, giving us at least 18 months' notice that they might have a status change in mind.
Thank you very much. While there might have been some influx, but I think it's fair to say since the Trump administration formed office, there's been a significant change with respect to asylum seekers crossing over to Canada irregularly. And we have seen the numbers spike and continue to go up over this period of time. So I think it's fair to say that there is some correlation with respect to that. And in fact, Amnesty International did an informal survey of some of the asylum seekers early on, and their finding was exactly that the asylum seekers are in fact saying that they cannot get due process in the United States, which is part of the issue around safety, and for asylum seekers to be able to access due process. So to that end, my question and a short answer from the ministers, have you had the opportunity to read the report from Amnesty International?
The report is certainly available to my officials in my department. I have read portions of the analysis, and those observations are always worth studying and taking into account in our analysis. What that analysis, though, would not cover is the circumstance where someone obtains a visitor visa at a United States travel office in some foreign country, comes to the United States, is only in the United States for perhaps a week or two or a month or two, and then comes to the Canadian border. That suggests a different set of factors.
So let me just
that don't necessarily depend on domestic U.S. policy.
Let me then just break in from here then, maybe to the Ministry of Immigration. Do you have the breakdown of how many individuals that are crossing over from the United States through a secondary visa, and how many of them are here to seek asylum without that visa? Maybe the officials could answer that question.
It really depends on the nationality. For example, the Nigerian nationals at the moment, the majority of them have valid U.S. visas and have stayed in the United States for very short periods of time, less than 6 months.
Maybe I can ask the minister to table with this committee the exact breakdown of what nationality from what country that fall under these different categories, so that we actually have that data before us to say how many of them are here on a visa and then how of them are not.
We can certainly do that.
Well, thank you. So then my question to Minister Hussain, have you had the opportunity to read the report from Amnesty International?
As similar to Minister Goodale, the report is available to my department. I haven't read the complete report. I've read portions of it and the analysis that it's based on.
I would urge both ministers to read the report because I think it is very informative and relevant to our discussion today.
You have about a half a minute left.
On the question around resources, can the minister advise how many staff have been reallocated from IRCC to asylum seekers to deal with the asylum seekers situation?
I'll have answer this one.
Chair, it depends. Thank you, Chair. It depends on what time frame we're talking about. We had previously provided statistics to the committee for last summer's movement, which was around 153 employees being reallocated. This year we have 62 employees working on irregular migration.
I'm afraid I need to cut you off there. Mr. Tabera, Mr. Sarai, who's first?
First, and then
okay.
I'll split my time with Mr. Sarai. Thank you for both ministers for being here, and this question will be to both of you, so feel free for either one of you to answer. According to the United Nations, there are 65 million forcibly displaced individuals around the world. With that being said, we've seen a large number of asylum seekers coming to the Canadian border, and Canada needs to adjust our operations accordingly when we see that happen. So can you elaborate to the committee about some of the operations that you've changed, maybe some additional resources that you've put in place?
Very briefly, from the point of view of the agencies in public safety, principally CBSA and the RCMP, last year, when faced with the beginning of these circumstances, both agencies made internal adjustments that they've described many times in the public arena to make sure that they have the personnel and the physical facilities properly located in order to cope with sudden and unexpected and unusual movements at the border. Those reassignments and rearrangements are for a temporary period of time in order to make sure that we accomplish two objectives: enforce all Canadian laws and respect all of Canada's international obligations. And to this point, the very proficient people who work for both CBSA and the RCMP have accomplished both of those objectives and accomplished them very well. Independent organizations that have observed the operations at the border have been very complimentary about the way in which CBSA and the RCMP, as well as the IRCC officials, have handled the circumstances that they have been faced with. As we reviewed the circumstances last year, learned the lessons from last year, and began to prepare for what might happen in 2018, we concluded, both Minister Hussain and I, that while some internal reorganization was again possible this year, that it would be necessary to have additional resources. We went to our cabinet colleagues to request those additional resources, and as you know, they were provided in the last budget, about $174 million, divided over 2 years, and as between my agencies and Minister Hussain's agencies, which gives us extra capacity for physical facilities and personnel properly and strategically located to achieve our proper public policy objectives.
If I can just stop you there, just my colleague would want to get a question in.
Sure. I first want to commend Commissioner Lucky for coming out to her maiden SIM meeting, and along with Mr. Cloutier, I want to commend you on maintaining the integrity of our border and the processing of refugees. I think it's commendable, and the way we do it, it's one of the rarest ways of any country that has been able to do it on an unmanned border crossing, an unfenced border crossing, but to also process them in a safe, secure, and a humanitarian way is something the world should model. My colleagues in the Conservative Party continue to kind of lay out some serious proposals, they think, which is to maybe have the entire border crossing, all 9,000 kilometers of it, designated as an official border crossing, which we have confirmed from the CBSA would be very expensive and completely unrealistic. I ask you, Minister Goodale, if you can comment on the feasibility of this and tell us what it would require. Also, what are the practicalities or impracticalities of making the entire Canada-U.S. border one continuous port of entry? And then if you can elaborate, would you need the U.S. cooperation, as usually our border security requires it? And what kind of resources would you need to make this happen?
Well, the border between Canada and U.S. is certainly an amazing accomplishment. It is the longest, most open, unmilitarized, and most successful boundary in the history of the world. The numbers of people that flow back and forth across that border every day, some 400,000, absolutely trouble-free, and about $2.5 billion worth of trade every day, most of it absolutely trouble-free. All of that is a remarkable accomplishment. It functions on the basis of officially designated ports of entry. There are roughly 120 of them across the 8,000 or 9,000 kilometers of boundary. If you were to declare all of that boundary, all 8,000 or 9,000 kilometers, a port of entry, then you would indeed require the collaboration of our counterparts in the United States across that whole length of distance, and you would probably need a border officer about every 100 yards or so in order to make sure that this just wasn't a myth or a fiction. I understand the intent behind the proposal, but quite frankly, it's impractical in terms of implementation. It also means that you would diffuse the potential traffic to much more remote locations and, quite frankly, areas across the country where enforcement would be much more difficult. It would actually, in my view, tend to make the problem worse rather than better. I understand the intent, but it's not, in my judgment, an appropriate solution.
How receptive are the Americans to proposals to fix this issue or resolve this, as border security between two countries is usually integral? We do the electronic travel advisory based on recommendations that they wanted, a kind of a border around North America. Are they receptive to resolving this issue? If so, how much? And if you can elaborate on that.
We have
10 seconds.
Border conversations quite literally all of the time, almost on a daily basis. There's a dialogue going on. And in a number of areas, for example, giving advance notice of policy changes and trying to interdict travel that is inappropriate. There's cooperation, but we need to do more, and we need more of their cooperation too.
We're going to have time for 2 more 5-minute rounds. From the Conservatives, I believe you're sharing it. Mr. Maguire, Mr. Tilson, who's first? Mr. Maguire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say that, we've heard recently that there has been a dramatic increase in the number of refusals of visas for Venezuelan visitors to Canada. And so while the government denies that border crossings are having an impact on other streams, is your department proactively refusing visas out of fear of a small percentage, Mr. Singh, of asylum claims from those countries to mitigate the numbers that we're seeing at the borders?
The fact of the matter is asylum claimants are processed by the independent quasi-judicial Immigration Refugee Board. It's an entirely separate process from all the other streams of immigration. Overseas refugees, economic immigrants, as well as family class immigrants, they're all processed by IRCC. And in those categories, we've actually made a lot of progress in terms of bringing down processing times, eliminating
but specifically,
or
Mr. Chair, we've seen
backlogs.
specifically, numbers from Venezuela, and that's my question. A dramatic increase in the numbers of refusals. Can the minister respond to that?
I'm not sure, Mr. Chair, what the connection is between visa refusal rates and asylum claims in Canada. I'm not quite sure what the question is trying to link.
Well, Mr. Chair, the government denies that border crossings are having an impact on other streams. So is your department proactively refusing visas out of fear of a small percentage of asylum claims, like I asked before, from those countries to mitigate the numbers that we're seeing at the borders?
Visa decisions are made
particularly with Venezuela.
Visa decisions are made by immigration officials based on the criteria of the application and based on the individual, what they present, the documents and the evidence that they show, the purpose of their travel, their background, their roots into their community and so on. And the risk of them overstaying or claiming asylum in Canada is certainly part of the determination process.
Mr. Chair, 28,000 individuals have illegally entered the country in the past 18 months, and only 1% have been removed. You know, this number is indicative of the chaos that this is causing. There's a real concern that these illegal border crossers have to wait years to get an IRB hearing, even if they have no legitimate asylum claim. They then could apply for permanent resident on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. So I'm asking for an ironclad commitment from you, Mr. Singh, today to ensure that failed asylum claimants do not get to stay in Canada because it took IRB years and years to process their claims.
Mr. Chair, if I could perhaps respond.
Minister Hussain.
The issue of removals, Mr. Maguire, is the function of CBSA. And with the assistance of the budget allocations that were made in March, covering this year and next year, the apparatus around removals will have more resources. Obviously, the requirements of due process need to be adhered to, but there have been some procedural changes that have been implemented.
Mr. Chair,
and we're also working very hard to get greater international cooperation on the necessary travel documents that need to be obtained in every case of a removal.
You know, my colleague just asked across the way, he thinks this process that we're going through in Canada today is a model that the rest of the world should look at. We got 28,000 individuals that illegally entered our country. Only 1% have been removed, yet the government continues to say that 80 or 90% of them will go back to the United States. And I'm just asking, how long does it take? Some of them are here for a year and a half, and before they get that removal notice. Never mind how much longer after that it is before they are actually removed from the country. So I'm asking if these failed asylum claimants don't get to stay in Canada because it took IRB years and years to process their claims. I mean, this is not a model that you'd want to pass to the rest of the world, Mr. Speaker, and I'm just wondering why the minister indicates that 1% being removed when there's 80 to 90% by his own words that indicate should be removed. That leaves 79 to 89% of the people that are supposed to be removed aren't being removed. Did he answer that?
Let you know you're at 5 minutes, which is your time. Did Mr. Tilson want to make one question? I would give you an extra little bit of time.
A little bit.
Yeah, you're at 5 minutes. You're at your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Minister Hussain, the Mayor of Toronto says his taxpayers are out $64.5 million as a result of having to deal with the influx of illegal border crossers that the minister has really foisted on his own city. My question to you, sir, is whether you intend to reimburse the City of Toronto for the costs being imposed by them by this crisis?
Very briefly.
Thank you for the question. We are working with both Quebec and Ontario to institute a triage system that moves asylum claimants away from Toronto and Montreal to identify other temporary housing sites. And in terms of the reimbursement of costs that are being claimed by provinces such as Quebec and Ontario, and to a certain extent Manitoba, those discussions are ongoing at an officials level.
Thank you, Minister. We have 5 minutes left for Mr. Whalen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay. First to you, Mr. Hussein. It seems that periodically Canada experiences irregular migration from different sources. You know, in the early 2000s from Mexico, last summer from Haiti, now this year there's an issue regarding Nigeria. And I'm just wondering if you'd speak a little bit to how the government has learned from each of these experiences, what we're doing better this year as compared to last year in the early 2000s in order to stem the flow of irregular migrants at our borders, and if there are other countries of origin that the department has identified that you're responding to currently.
Thank you very much. The global picture is very clear. There are more people on the move now than ever before since the Second World War, so we're certainly not immune to those pressures. Many other countries have received irregular migrants at much higher numbers than Canada. So we are, to a certain extent, insulated by three oceans, but we have a southern border, and that is something that we're experiencing this year. In terms of what we're doing to adapt to the lessons last year that we learned from the influx last year, we were able to put into a national contingency plan that is regionally specific, which has really put us in much better position this year in terms of our response. Our outreach campaign has had an impact in terms of outreach to diaspora communities in the United States that were impacted by the temporary protected status regime in the United States. And we have not stopped that outreach campaign. In fact, it has extended to outside of the United States. So, and that's important because there's a lot of misinformation that preys on people who tells them that jumping the border into Canada is actually a free ticket, and we tell them that's not the case.
Along those lines, you know, many of the legitimate concerns that the opposition parties have with respect to the irregular border crossing is that, you know, Canada is a generous country with regards to refugee and asylum seekers. We look around the world, we work closely with the UNHCR to make sure we identify the most vulnerable. Yeah. And there's a concern that many of the irregular border crossers are not proper asylum seekers, that they aren't the most vulnerable people in the world, and therefore they're queue jumping. And then they end up in Canada potentially for long periods of time. So what are each of your departments doing to make sure that we're quickly and efficiently processing these applications? What arrangements are we making with our international partners to ensure that these false asylum seekers can be quickly rendered back to their home countries?
That's a good question. On the issue of who is entitled to refugee protection and who is not is an issue that is determined by the Immigration Refugee Board. Each and every asylum claimant gets to present their case in front of the IRB. And if they're found to have a legitimate refugee claim, they get to stay in Canada. If not, they're removed. It's as simple as that. What we've been trying to do is to sensitize diaspora populations in the United States to give them the full picture and full information of our immigration and asylum systems, so that they're able to dispel misinformation that's been fed to them. We have engaged with NGOs that serve those communities so that they can also disseminate that information. In addition to that, we're working very closely with the United States because specific to the Nigerian nationals, they are coming to our border with, many of them have valid U.S. visas. So if you're able to gain an entry into the United States, the Safe Third Country Agreement states that you should claim asylum in the first country of presence. And so we're working to make sure that we work with the United States to share information so that they can tighten their visa issuing regime and get the cooperation of Nigeria with respect to the issuing of travel documents.
Mr. Chair, specifically on the question as it relates to CBSA, the additional resources that were obtained in the budget will assist CBSA and the RCMP in all elements of what they do in managing the border. First of all, making sure of safety and security at the initial border crossing. Secondly, following up on investigations and security clearances and the necessary documentation that needs to be achieved. And then thirdly, in the process of removals. Having the extra resources will help CBSA and the RCMP to improve in all three of those categories of activities. Secondly, we are focusing on countries that have historically declined to be cooperative in the removals process. Obviously, if we're removing someone, we're removing them not to the United States, but to some other country. We need to get travel documents from that country so that the person can be returned to that country. Most countries cooperate, a few do not. Minister Hussein was very successful in dealing with Nigeria just a few weeks ago, in order to gain their higher degree of commitment to cooperate with Canada in supplying the necessary travel documents to facilitate removals. CBSA is working on the backlog that exists, and their process should be able to show increased results over the course of the spring and summer.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, committee. We're just after 1 o'clock, so we're going to end there, and I thank you.